Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Tales of Herding God Part 122 based on novel. So let's start. The corners of Long Yu's eyes twitched furiously. The entire mountain and wilderness were covered with Qin Mu's sword. So how was he going to fight? Just the weight of those swords alone could squash him to death. Long Yu looked at Hermit Qin Mu, who appeared to not notice anything. Taking out 8,000 swords may look like a simple task, but it would exhaust the cultivation of most Six Directions realms divine arts practitioners. Only Qin Mu, this fellow with unbelievably dense cultivation, could execute that many flying swords in one go, right? On top of that, controlling so many flying swords needed extremely high attainments in algebra and calculation. A brain with good reaction speed was necessary in order to control each of the flying swords, so that they wouldn't interfere with each other. Just the calculation of the roots for the 8,000 swords required a sick level of attainment in algebra. It was obvious that Qin Mu had already fused Dao Sec's Dao sword with village chief's sword skills. That's why he was able to control so many flying swords. Could this world really have overlord body? Hermit Qin Mu was in doubt. If there was an overlord body, it would definitely exist in the records of Little Jade Capital. Ever since he had dragged his disheartened self back to Little Jade Capital, he had read most of the books, and there were no records even related to something like an overlord body. The books collected in Little Jade Capital were all-inclusive, tracing all the way back to the eras of long ago. This was something that other sects and sacred grounds could not imagine. There were no records of Overlord body in Little Jade Capital, so Overlord body couldn't exist. Because of that, Hermit Qin Mu was sure that village chief was lying. However, when he saw Qin Mu's performance, his confidence was shaken. "Senior brother Long Yu, please," Qin Mu said again. Long Yu composed himself and said solemnly, "Human Emperor, please." Fire blazed in his eyes as he thought to himself, this human emperor needs to control that many flying swords, which is definitely exhausting to him. One or two moves with all of them will probably exhaust all of his cultivation. I just need to withstand a move or two, and I'll be able to turn defeat into victory. Yet he soon discovered that he had overthought the matter. Qin Mu didn't give him any chance to withstand an attack. He immediately used the fourth writing of Dao Sword, turning heavenly cycle silently, meeting every manifestation of nature shifting. 8,000 swords instantly circulated the heavenly cycle stars, and executed the manifestation of nature. When Dao Master Lin Xian tested Qin Mu on his attainments in algebra, he had used the calculation of heavenly cycle stars' heaven chess transformation. The mathematical reasoning in there was the fourth writing of Dao Sword. Qin Mu executed that, turning heavenly cycle silently, meeting every manifestation of nature shifting, causing the starry sky and a galaxy to operate vividly above them. Each move of 14 writings of Dao Sword was stronger than the last, and when it came to the fourth writing, the 8,000 swords transformed into heavenly stars that filled the sky. Right away, Long Yu was trapped in the sword formation. He didn't have the time to think. Flames burst forth from his eyes, and as they opened and closed, two trails of snow-white sword lights flew out from them. His sword skill was different from the common paths, and was a kind of ultimate art in Little Jade Capital. Long Yu mainly cultivated his eyes, but different from other eye skills, he cultivated sword skills in them. His eyes and his sword became one, which came from the art called Secrets of Heavenly Eyes Sword Heart. The strength of this kind of sword skills lay in the fact that there was no need to cultivate spirit weapons or spirit swords. Instead, by treating one's eyes as sword pellets, the sword would point towards what the eyes saw. It was much more direct and straightforward. In addition, this art possessed a unique technique. When the eyes transformed into huge blazing suns, the sword lights could conquer every obstacle. When they began to shine with starlight, that was as brilliant as the galaxy, no enemy would be able to guard against them. If Long Yu managed to succeed in cultivating the sword heart, then with the heart and sword as one, he'd become even scarier than with the sword eyes. The moment his heart thought of a move, the sword would execute it. Long Yu hadn't reached this realm yet, but his sword eyes were already extraordinary. Yet the next moment, the countless flying swords crumbled his two trails of sword lights. They were made out of vital qi, while Qin Mu's swords were treasures made from the stuff scourged in heavenly devil cult. Their quality far surpassed that of the sword lights Long Yu had cultivated, and due to Qin Mu's incomparably dense cultivation, the sword lights were overwhelmed. Starlight burst forth from Long Yu's eyes, flowing like they were out in the galaxy, colliding head-on with the transformation of the fourth writing of Dao Sword. The sword skills of the two people may have seemed similar, but there were differences in their essence. Dao Sword used mathematical reasoning to construct the heavenly stars, and had the composition of mathematical reasoning on transformation. Secrets of Heavenly Eyes Sword Heart, however, did whatever they pleased, changing along with the heart. Its intricacy wasn't comparable to that of Dao Sword, but it surpassed Dao Sect in transformation. However, when comparing the two swords, Long Yu's sword light was far inferior. Long Yu grunted, and the galaxy that had burst forth from his eyes was extinguished. The 8,000 swords transformed into sword rain that shredded the galaxy. When they came shooting down, Long Yu heard Hermit Qin Yu's shout out, "Spare him." The next moment, he saw the flying swords surround him as if he had become a huge sword pellet. He was situated inside it, and the swaying sword tips were pointed at every part of his body. This raised a certain question in his head: if they were to descend, would he even have a corpse afterward? The sword pellets split open and gathered into a long river made from sword light, as the swords went back into the Daotai sack on Qin Mu's back. Long Yu hurriedly touched all over his body and discovered that he was still complete. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. He wanted to thank Qin Mu, yet all his limbs had gone numb at some point. His throat was also parched, unable to make a sound. Mu Qingdai immediately came forward and brought him clean water. Long Yu drank a mouthful and only then was able to speak. "Much thanks for sparing me, human emperor. However, I didn't lose in sword skills. You overwhelmed me with your treasure." Qin Mu didn't deny and said humbly, "Senior brother Long Yu is right. I haven't cultivated Dao Sword diligently, only worked on it for 10 days. I'm actually not that good at it." Long Yu's expression instantly turned black, and his throat became parched again. He croaked, "Not good at Dao Sword." Qin Mu took a look at Village Chief and said, "I learned sword skills from Grandpa Village Chief, but what he taught me is too powerful. I'm scared that I couldn't hold my power back. My attainments in Dao Sword aren't high, so you could still block my attack." Long Yu immediately drank a few mouthfuls of water, but his throat was still slightly dry. Mu Qingdai's gaze flickered, and she asked, "In that case, can human Emperor Qin execute his strongest sword skill?" Wang Muren's gaze also sparkled, as he revealed a look of anticipation. If what they just saw were Qin Mu's attainments in Dao Sect skills, then how strong would his strongest sword skill be? Qin Mu revealed a troubled expression. He looked at Village Chief and said in shame, "There are some flaws in my sword skill." "No, I can't say some, there are flaws everywhere. Especially recently, they've been increasing all the time." Long Yu, Mu Qingdai, and Wang Muren were all dumbfounded. Hermit Qin Yu was also astonished. There are still times he is actually humble. Qin Mu's face was full of shame. "My strongest sword skill was defeated by Grandpa Village Chief, and I have never won against him before. I then met my father, and I never won against him either. When Imperial Preceptor was comprehending the path earlier, I peeked at him, and the number of flaws in my skills have increased once again. The few months on Qin Hanjin's treasured ship was the time when Qin Mu had suffered the greatest setback. Qin Hanjin in the painting had fed him moves and beat him down over and over again. If Qin Mu hadn't beaten Pangong so up once in a while to feel better, his confidence wouldn't have recovered. When Imperial Preceptor was comprehending the path, Qin Mu had peeked into his Dao heart to observe the entire process. It had then shocked him to the extreme. However, this had resulted in another consequence as well. His horizons had expanded drastically and reached a height that he'd never imagined before. When Qin Mu thought about the sword skill he had improved, he realized that there were even more flaws in it when he saw before. Village Chief revealed an astonished expression and said, "Mua, execute your sword skill that's full of flaws. I'd like to take a look." Qin Mu hesitated, then said, "In that case, I shall embarrass myself." He took in a breath with deep concentration, and Carefree Sword hummed as it came out of the sheath. Qin Mu held it in his hand, and the blade flashed with sword light. Instantly, countless flying swords flew out of the Dao Tai sack on his back. They flew into Carefree Sword one after another. 3,000 swords merged together. Carefree Sword was the mother sword, and the rest of the swords were the child swords which could enter it. As a professional in forging treasures, Qin Mu knew that there were two types of shapes to a sword pellet. Child swords entering the mother sword was one of them, but because his magic power and strength were limited, he could only fuse 3,000 swords. If he added any more, it wouldn't be as easy to use Carefree Sword, and it would restrict him from using any skills. Qin Mu's gaze was focused on the tip of the sword as if there was nothing else in the world. He then executed his sword skill, and Carefree Sword started to move clumsily in his hand. Whoosh! The surging of wind rang out. Qin Mu's Carefree Sword moved very slowly, but it gave off a sound of an unimaginably heavy object crushing the air. He executed his sword skill. As Carefree Sword moved, child swords started to fly out from it as though they were its afterimages. Sword lights continued to break up continuously, and every child sword that flew out executed a different sword move. The 17 basic sword moves were displayed through the trajectories of those flying swords, and when the disorderly sword moves overlapped each other, the sword skill also became messy and irregular. What Qin Mu had executed was sword-treading mountains and rivers. However, it was completely different from the one village chief had taught him. His sword skill was very clumsy, and didn't have the feeling of agility. Only when the movement of Carefree Sword gradually grew faster did it gain it. The child swords in the air slowly increased in speed, while the sword skill also became faster and faster, dancing with Carefree Sword. The expression on Hermit Qingyu's face became grimmer and grimmer, while Long Yu, Mu Qingdai, and Wang Muren started to realize that they couldn't understand what they were seeing. The sword reasoning that was involved in Qin Mu's sword skill became more and more complicated, more and more profound. In the sky above the celestial mountain, the 3,000 flying swords would gather and disperse like clouds from time to time, transforming into majestic mountains that dispersed the water vapor, and even transformed into a long river in the sky, or tens of thousands of trees that overflowed with green. They were so detailed that even the vein lines on the leaves could be seen. After a moment, all of the sword lights vanished. Qin Mu shook his Carefree Sword, and all the flying swords flew out from it to go back into the Dao Tai sack on his back. There's no need to compete. Mu Qingdai came to her senses and immediately said, "My cultivation is a line inferior to that of senior brother Long Yu, so let's not compete." Wang Muren shook his head as well. "I also won't be able to take this attack, so there's no need to compete. I admit defeat." Long Yu's expression was pale white and his mouth was agape. He realized that his throat was dry again, and he immediately gulped 2 mouthfuls of water. He said, "Your sword skill, I don't understand it." Hermit Qingyu fell into a daze. He looked at Qin Mu before looking at village chief, then sighed. "Old Dao brother, you have taken in a good disciple." His sword skills have already entered the path. Village chief shook his head and said, I didn't teach him to cultivate sword this way, he comprehended himself. Mua, your sword skill really has many flaws, it's like a broken sieve that's leaking air everywhere. You need to continue working harder. If you meet someone whose knowledge is higher than yours, you won't even know how you died. Qin Mu's hair stood on end, and he muttered, I also see too many flaws, but it's just that I can't improve it anymore. Who teaches their disciple this way? Hermit Qin Mu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This sword skill could clearly be considered one of the most powerful in this world, right? Those that can surpass him would be people that reached the sword path. Hermit Qin Mu's evaluation of Qin Mu's sword skill could be said to be extremely high. One of the most powerful sword skills in the world couldn't be achieved by simply learning a few profound sword skills. It required one to have an extremely high understanding of the sword and have reached the level of skill where one could create their own sword skills. Qin Mu's current standard surpassed sword techniques and reached the realm of skill. Even though he said his move was full of flaws, those who could see them were experts that were either half a step into the sword path, or experts that had already entered the sword path. Such people in the world were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns, and could be counted on one's hands. For Qin Mu to have entered the stage of skill at such a young age, even if his sword skill was full of flaws in his eyes, it was still an incomparably marvelous work of art in the eyes of others who had yet to enter that stage. Yet village chief was still not satisfied with such a disciple, saying that he was a broken sieve full of holes and wouldn't know how he died when he faced a superior opponent. This requirement was simply too high. But Qin Mu actually acknowledged it and wasn't resentful or complacent in the least. This kind of humbleness was much more sincere than the humbleness he had shown after defeating Long Yu. Hermit Qin Mu shook his head. This pair of master and disciple are weirdos. His eyes sparkled, and he said solemnly, Human Emperor Qin, the defeat of the 3 disciples of my little jade capital doesn't mean that your abilities are high. They are merely 10 to 20% higher than theirs. Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi will be the true test. When he said that, Long Yu and Mu Qingdai revealed ashamed looks as they thought that Hermit Qin Mu was saving face for them. Wang Muren, on the other hand, seemed to be thinking about something. Immortal Qin Yu's judgment is truly extraordinary. Qin Mu nodded. My abilities are indeed 10 to 20% higher than theirs. This sentence of his was no longer humble. It was stating the facts. They were all at 6 directions realm, and when their cultivation ability reached that step, being 10 to 20% stronger than the opponent meant that one could defeat them in 1 or 2 moves. After all, the scope and knowledge they possessed were completely different. When one's abilities reached their level, if they wanted to continue improving, they would need lots of hard work in order to improve 10%. It was extremely difficult to improve under such conditions. That 10 to 20% advantage was extremely hard to get. If Qin Mu hadn't stepped into the realm of skill, he would have needed more than a few moves if he wanted to defeat Long Yu and Mu Qingdai. Muren, you guys shall withdraw. Human Emperor Qin, follow me. I will bring you to Hall of 3 Aeons. Hermit Qin Yu then walked down the mountain. Wang Muren and the rest revealed expressions of envy, and Long Yu muttered in a low voice, When can I enter Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi? Village chief immediately said, Many thanks, Dao friend Qin Yu. Hermit Qin Yu shook his head and said, Human Emperor, has the right to enter Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi. Qin Mu followed them, bewildered. From their words, Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi don't seem like some test, but like a huge opportunity. Grandpa Village Chief has already thanked Immortal Qin Yu twice, and for him to do that, those places cannot be ordinary. However, didn't Xu Xinghua also enter Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi? He used 10 days to pass through both of them, so it doesn't seem like they're something that's worthy of Grandpa Village Chief thanks. He thought that Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi would just be immortals of Little Jade Capital fighting him personally, giving him a test of sorts. However, he was no longer so sure. Village Chief floated over and smiled. Since Mu is allowed to enter Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi, why don't you just open Hall of 6 Directions as well? Hermit Qin Mu sneered. Dao friend, don't be unsatisfied with small gains. Village Chief sneered back at him. You allowed Xu Xinghua from high heavens to enter Hall of 3 Aeons and Hall of 5 Qi. So is Human Emperor inferior to Xu Xinghua? Hermit Qin Mu shook his head. High heavens is extremely strong and not inferior to Hall of Human Emperors. They are even stronger. I need a bowl of water as a scale, for I can't show favoritism, or else I will be criticized. Village Chief tried to agitate him then. The number 1 sacred ground is merely so. Aren't you just afraid of high heavens creating trouble for you? Hermit Qin Mu said indifferently, you can't rile me up. Little Jade Capital became known as the number 1 sacred ground, because of outsiders forcing that title on us. We have never claimed it ourselves. Dao friend, you can stop trying. While talking, they came to a celestial mountain and went up it, until Hall of 3 Aeons appeared right in front of them. There were 3 immortals of Little Jade Capital waiting outside the hall, who looked much older than Village Chief, Dao Master, and the rest. Their eye sockets were sunken in, making their eyes look round and small. Their white hair and long eyebrows were all dragging on the ground, so even though they were standing, they seemed very short. The height of those 3 old immortals and Xiong Chia was about the same. Senior brothers, thank you for the trouble. Hermit Qin Mu greeted the 3 men. The old immortals returned his greeting and said, Human Emperor has come to visit, so we naturally have to receive him politely. Village Chief's gaze flickered and he said, the 3 Aeons of Little Jade Capital. How are you guys still alive? You're all much older than I. The old immortals took a look at him, and an old woman said with her sunken mouth that had no teeth, Earth Count must have forgotten about us. That's why he hasn't come to claim our lives. Village Chief was bewildered. The 3 old immortals dragged their long eyebrows and white hair into the hall and said, Human Emperor, please follow us. Qin Mu caught up to them, a little afraid that these people would step on their own hair or eyebrows. Luckily, that didn't happen. Their white eyebrows and hair were like living objects, as they were always able to avoid the feet. Could it be that because they had lived for so long that their hair also became spirits? Qin Mu guessed secretly. Suddenly, he stepped on the air and leaped into the sky. His vital qi trembled and transformed into wings on his back. Qin Mu then flapped them to hover in the sky, his body moving up and down. In front of him, bright flames surged forth and dazzled his eyes. Formation markings appeared layer after layer, as Qin Mu operated 9 Heaven's Eyes awakening skill to open green Heaven's Eyes. Only then was he able to look at the incomparably bright flames in front of him. The flames filled the entire sky, but they rapidly moved away. A huge blazing sun pulled farther and farther away from him before stopping in the sky. Then, a cool sensation came from the back. Qin Mu hurriedly turned around and saw a huge moon covering the sky behind him. It was also pulling away rapidly. The heaven Aeon as the sun, the water Aeon as the moon, then where's the earth Aeon? Qin Mu looked at his feet, and saw dirt yellow streams of air flowing everywhere. As they churned below, huge mountains slowly rose from the ground without any regular pattern. When the 3 Aeons flowed together, they immediately became verdant hills and limpid water with all living things growing in the auspicious and peaceful world. Human Emperor, do you choose to break through the heaven Aeon, the earth Aeon, or the water Aeon? A rumbling voice which could deafen the ears asked. Qin Mu looked toward the source of the sound and saw a brilliant gold god standing upright in the sun. Behind him was a three-legged golden crow. The god also had 3 legs, and there was also a third eye at the heart of his brows, while in his hand was a huge bell. Qin Mu turned back to take a look and saw that there was a woman in the moon. She was sparkling with silvery light, her hair like silver threads. A huge toad stood behind her back with dark and muddled eyes. The female god held an osmanthus tree in her hand while her silver-white clothing fluttered in the breeze. Qin Mu looked down and saw the third god. His body was tall and upright, with yellow dragons coiling all around him. The yellow air bobbed up and down under his feet, as it continuously surged around. Qin Mu breathed in the air, and instantly felt different kinds of energy pouring toward him. This actually made his spirit embryo grow a bit. He couldn't help being astonished. After cultivating to his step, almost all of the marvels of spirit embryo divine treasure had been uncovered, so there could be no more improvement. Yet at this place, spirit embryo divine treasure seemed to be able to continue improving. What is this place? Qin Mu asked loudly. Where are the 3 elders from earlier? This is the spirit embryo divine treasure of a god, the brilliant golden god in the sun said, his voice like thunder. This god is already dead, so only his body remains. I'm Heaven Aeon spiritual master, with secret arts. I became the Heaven Aeon of this god. I'm Water Aeon spiritual master, said a voice from the bright moon behind Qin Mu. I used secret arts to become the Water Aeon of this god. And I'm Earth Aeon. The earth under Qin Mu's feet swirled and rose. The giant stood still, but his body rose up with a swirl of air. A huge and twisted mountain then rose up in front of Qin Mu. The giant looked down at Qin Mu from above. Earth Aeon spiritual master pays his respects to human emperor. After being stunned for some time, Qin Mu came to a realization. You're much older than Grandpa Village Chief, but the reason you haven't died is not because Earth Count forgot about you guys. It's because you guys borrowed the spirit embryo divine treasure of this god to continue living. Earth Aeon spiritual master didn't have the doddering appearance of when he was outside the hall. In his incomparably heavy voice, he said, what you guessed is right. Human emperors are indeed all smart people. The lifespan of the 3 of us has already surpassed 2,000 years. If it were other people, they would have died 3 or 4 times. No matter if they were strong practitioners that were close to gods, they still couldn't escape the fate of being born, growing old, then getting sick and dying. However, we live on by having seized an opportunity. Golden light fluttered around Heaven Aeon spiritual master, and flames grew out from his back like rainbows and wings. We aren't clinging to our lives at death's door, but are trying to choose the best talent in Little Jade Capital to push them one step forward. We want to let them take a look at the marvel of a god's divine treasures to achieve a breakthrough. However, if they want to receive the benefits, they have to pass the test of the 3 Aeons. Behind Qin Mu, Water Aeon spiritual master's lights floated like rainbows as she came to Qin Mu's side. She then said, Test of the 3 Aeons asks one to challenge the elites transformed from the 3 Aeons of this god. Can you feel it? At this place, the density of the 3 Aeons is enough to push your spirit embryo a step forward. However, since the ancient times, there haven't been many that could reach the 3 Aeons of the god. Those who could were all top-notch people. Theirs is such a place in Little Jade Capital. Qin Mu's eyes lit up. 3 Aeons were Heaven Aeon, Earth Aeon, and Water Aeon. If he could achieve all 3 of them, his spirit embryo realm would definitely break through once more. Since his spirit embryo was already powerful enough to the point of being seen as abnormal, what level would it reach if it break through once again? However, based on what the 3 spiritual masters said, he would need to challenge the elites of the 3 Aeons in order to gain the benefits. And fighting with a god still made him uneasy. Hall of 3 Aeons can only be challenged once. In that case, do you choose Heaven Aeon breakthrough, Earth Aeon breakthrough, or Water Aeon breakthrough? Asked the three gods in unison. Qin Mu pondered over it, then asked loudly, Seniors, which is the strongest breakthrough? Of course 3 Aeons breakthrough is the strongest, the three of them said at the same time. Qin Mu's spirit was greatly roused, and he said in a loud and clear voice, In that case, I shall challenge the 3 Aeons. The three gods looked at one another, and saw their own astonishment in the eyes of the others. As you wish. The sun trembled, and a trail of flame flew out. At the same time, a silver light and a yellow light shot out from the moonlight and the land. The lights transformed into 3 youths that possessed extremely powerful auras. What was weird was that the 3 of them looked exactly the same. The 3 youths were all on 6 directions realm. Suddenly, they walked into each other, and their bodies overlapped. The aura of the body then increased drastically, and the corners of Qin Mu's eyes twitched irregularly. Maybe Heaven Aeon breakthrough might have been safer, he thought to himself. Outside Hall of 3 Aeons, village chief floated calmly in the air. Hermit Qin Mu took a glance at him. Dao brother sure is calm. You don't seem to be worried about whether your disciple will be able to clear the test of the 3 Aeons. You quite confident in him? Village chief had been reminiscing about the rocking chair that Qin Mu had made for him. He smiled. I'm confident in Mu's abilities. Even though the test of Hall of 3 Aeons is very difficult, there have been many people who had entered it, and a good number of them had passed. Mua is not weaker than them. Hermit Qin Mu's gaze flickered. Hall of 3 Aeons tests the 3 Aeons of the god, and Dao brother should know the pros and cons of that. After all, you were one of those who had entered back then. Aren't you the same? Village chief reminisced about the past and sighed. I had chosen Heaven Aeon breakthrough, what did you choose? Water Aeon breakthrough, Hermit Qin Mu said. I had lost while you had won. That was the reason you surpassed me. The reason I surpassed you wasn't because I had achieved Heaven Aeon breakthrough. My ability to struggle was just stronger than yours. Village chief looked at him and said with a serious expression, My fighting spirit is stronger than yours, and your ability to receive setbacks is also inferior to mine. Just a small difference in personality caused the gap between you and I to slowly increase. The inheritance of Little Jade Capital is actually not inferior to that of Hall of Human Emperor. If your fighting spirit had been stronger, your attainments wouldn't have been inferior to mine. Hermit Qin Mu snorted, not feeling too comfortable. He said, Heaven Aeon breakthrough, Earth Aeon breakthrough, and Water Aeon breakthrough, what do you think Human Emperor will choose? Village chief didn't think twice and said, he will choose the strongest one. Hermit Qin Mu's body trembled, and he revealed a look of disbelief. 3 Aeons breakthrough. Village chief nodded and said leisurely, his belief is stronger than mine was back then, and his fighting spirit is even greater. He possesses a matchless belief in himself, and a fighting spirit that has no equal in this world. So he will definitely choose 3 Aeons breakthrough. Yet you aren't the slightest bit worried. Hermit Qin Mu cried out. You have experienced this kind of test before, so you should know how frightening 3 Aeons breakthrough is. He has no chance to win. Actually, village chief smiled, and his face wrinkled up like a dried mandarin. His smile was ugly yet full of happiness. Mua is already stronger than I was back then, he just hasn't realized it himself. And it's not just by a little bit. He should be able to pass 3 Aeons breakthrough. Hermit Qin Mu's face suddenly turned cold, and he sneered, Dao brother, I don't think his confidence is invincible, it's just your confidence in him that is invincible. However, you are not from our Little Jade Capital, so you don't know how terrifying 3 Aeons breakthrough is. He will have to face a young god on the same realm as him. Overlord Body has never lost to any divine arts practitioner on the same realm. Village chief said solemnly. Hermit Qin Mu went into a frenzy. Overlord body again. In the history, there has been only one person who passed 3 Aeons breakthrough. He was the saint that appears once every 500 years, and was acclaimed by heavenly saint cult. Only he passed 3 Aeons breakthrough. Hermit Qin Mu then sneered and added, and then he died. He was beaten to death by Tao sect and Roland's Golden Palace along with all the righteous Taoists in the world. After that, there were a few others that were acclaimed as saints that had entered Hall of 3 Aeons. Want to try guessing if they passed the test? No. They got beaten up like dead pigs, and got hauled out from Hall of 3 Aeons, without even having entered Hall of 5 Qi behind. Village chief was astonished. There are such useless saints. Hermit Qin Mu was displeased and rolled his eyes at him. He said, "This god isn't one of those fake gods in high heavens, it's a true god. Otherwise, Shu Xinghua of high heavens wouldn't have stayed so long in our little jade capital. There are quite a lot of the so-called gods in high heavens. Do you know the difference between fake gods and true gods? A true god reaches the god realm in every aspect, whereas you only possess the aspect of a sword god." Village chief was silent. He suddenly smiled and said, "Mua has never lost before, so losing once would also be good for him. If he can't win, it just means that he isn't working hard enough to bring out the fullest potential of Overlord body." Hermit Qin Mu was driven completely mad. Was there such a teacher in this world? I would like to know the origin of this god very much. Village chief's gaze sparkled, and he asked, "I wonder if Tao friend can tell me about it." In Hall of 3 Aeons, Qin Mu's expression was grim. There were 3 young gods, and if any of them would be placed in Eternal Peace Empire, they would be the greatest in 6 Directions realm. They might even be stronger than people like Daozi and Fozi. The most crucial thing was that no matter if it was experience or the breadth of the horizon, the young gods would far surpass them. That was the most terrifying point. Each young god represented 1 Aeon, and when the 3 of them merged together, their ability would be nearly equal to a young god at 6 Directions realm. His abilities had soared up in a straight line. It wasn't like the 3 old immortals hadn't met people who dared to challenge the 3 Aeons. After all, geniuses naturally had strong confidence. But confidence was just confidence. There weren't many who could complete the test of the 3 Aeons. However, since Qin Mu had chosen it, his end result would depend on his luck. The young god in front of him was expressionless, and looked like an emotionless machine. Suddenly, his strength burst forth, and he reached Qin Mu in a single step. "There's no difference when compared to my speed." Qin Mu was astonished as rumblings of thunder came from beside his ears. This sound reached him only after the young god had reached him. The rumblings of the thunder were left in his wake. Boom! The young god sent a punch, and a thunderclap exploded from the vibration of the space. This wasn't the power of a divine art, but was the abnormal occurrence caused by unleashing the pure strength of the corporeal body to its extremes. Corporeal body divine arts didn't rely on divine arts, but instead on the powerful corporeal body. Qin Mu didn't avoid, but threw his own punch forward. Just as their punches were about to strike each other, they moved through the air and flashed past mirages as they avoided the other's attack. Qin Mu's pupils shrank. Cripple's heaven-pilfering divine legs had met their first opponent. Since he was the number 1 divine thief in the world, his escaping speed naturally had to be fast, so fast that his enemies and pursuers could not catch up to him. Thus, Cripple had trained his legs to their extremes. If one was to say a part of him had already become a god, then it would be his legs. Ever since he was young, Qin Mu had cultivated alongside Cripple, and trained his legs to their extremes in 6 Directions realm. When talking purely about speed, even Pangong So was inferior to him. Yet the speed of the young god was no slower than his. This video will end here.